June 1941. A ravine called Babi Yar outside Kiev. Over 2 days, 33,771 Jews are murdered, machine-gunned into a mass grave. The Nazis who ordered it, the soldiers who carried it out, believed no one would ever know their names. They believed history would forget. They were wrong. Decades later, survivors would identify them. Decades after that, some would face execution. This is the story of how the memory of 10,000 civilians massacred by Nazis became the evidence that brought their killers to justice, and how that memory continues to demand remembrance today. June 22, 1941. Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The invasion shatters the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact signed just 2 years earlier. It opens a new front in the war, one that will prove to be the deadliest theater of the entire conflict. As German forces push eastward into Soviet territory, they encounter large Jewish populations. In Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Western Soviet Union, millions of Jews have lived for centuries. Now they fall under Nazi occupation. The Nazis had already persecuted and murdered Jews in Western Europe, but in the Soviet Union, the killing escalates to a new level. In the occupied territories, the Nazis implement what they call mobile killing units, Einsatzgruppen, special task forces assigned to murder Jews behind the front lines. These killing units are not the gas chambers of Auschwitz or Treblinka. They are face-to-face murders, shootings, massacres. Communities are rounded up, taken to ravines or forests, and shot. The bodies are buried in mass graves. One of the largest massacres occurs at Babi Yar. Babi Yar is a ravine in the Podil district of Kiev, Ukraine. In September 1941, the Nazi occupation authorities announced that all Jews in Kiev must report for relocation. Thousands gather, believing they will be transported to a ghetto. Instead, they are marched to Babi Yar. Over September 29 and 30, 1941, Nazi soldiers and Ukrainian collaborators machine-gunned 33,771 Jews into the ravine. Men, women, children, entire families. The shooting continues for 2 days. The bodies pile up. The ravine becomes a mass grave. The Nazis believed no one would know. They believed the graves would remain hidden. They believed that if the Soviet Union lost the war, the evidence would be destroyed. They believed history would be written by the victors, and the victors would be them. They were catastrophically wrong. Survivors escaped. They fled Kiev before the massacre. They hid. They survived in forests and partisan groups. And decades later, they would provide testimony that would identify the Nazi officers and soldiers who ordered and carried out the killings. But Babi Yar was not unique. It was one of thousands of massacres carried out by Einsatzgruppen across occupied Soviet territory. Historians estimate that these mobile killing units murdered over 1.4 million Jews during the war. In addition to Babi Yar, there were massacres at Ponary, near Vilna, where 100,000 Jews were murdered. Massacres at Kamenets-Podolsk, where 24,000 Jews were killed. Massacres at Sonderkommando 4A in the Caucasus, where thousands were murdered. And dozens more. The scale was overwhelming. The brutality was extreme. And for many years after the war, the world did not fully reckon with what had happened. But slowly, evidence accumulated. Survivors testified, historians researched, and the names of those responsible began to emerge. Some of the Nazis responsible for these massacres were tried at Nuremberg or in subsequent trials. Some were caught and prosecuted in the decades after the war. And some lived for decades believing they had escaped justice, only to be identified, tried, and executed or imprisoned in their final years. This is the story of how the memory of 10,000 civilians massacred by Nazis became the foundation for accountability, and how that accountability continues to resonate today. more than 80 years after the killings. The Einsatzgruppen were not regular Wehrmacht soldiers. They were specialized killing units formed specifically to murder Jews and other undesirables in occupied territories. There were 4 main Einsatzgruppen groups, labeled A through D. Each was assigned to a geographic area. Einsatzgruppe A operated in the Baltic states. Einsatzgruppe B operated in Belarus. Einsatzgruppe C operated in Ukraine. Einsatzgruppe D operated in the southern Soviet Union and the Caucasus. These units were staffed by both SS men and regular army personnel. They included officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men. Some were ideological Nazis, committed to racial genocide. Others were ordinary soldiers following orders. The commander of Einsatzgruppe A was SS Brigadeführer Franz Walther Stahlecker. His unit murdered over 250,000 Jews in the Baltic states and Belarus. The commander of Einsatzgruppe B was Arthur Nebe. His unit murdered over 45,000 Jews in Belarus. The commander of Einsatzgruppe C was Otto Ohlendorf. His unit murdered over 90,000 Jews in Ukraine and southern Russia. The commander of Einsatzgruppe D was Walther Bierkamp. His unit murdered over 90,000 Jews in the Caucasus and southern regions. These men were not low-level soldiers. They were officers in the Nazi security apparatus, answerable directly to Heinrich Himmler and the SS leadership. Their orders came from the highest levels of the Nazi government. The massacres followed a pattern. Communities were ordered to gather. They were told they were being relocated. Trucks or trains transported them to ravines or forests. Sometimes they were forced to dig their own graves. Then the shooting began. Machine guns were set up. Victims were lined up and shot. Those who tried to run were shot. Those who refused to move were beaten and shot. The killing continued until everyone was dead. The scale of these killings was staggering. At Babi Yar alone, over 33,000 people were murdered in 2 days. At Ponary, 100,000 were killed over the course of several months. But the killings were not random acts of wartime violence. They were systematic executions ordered by the Nazi government as part of its program to exterminate the Jewish people. The records kept by the Einsatzgruppen commanders provide documentation of their crimes. They submitted reports to their superiors detailing the numbers killed. These reports are matter-of-fact, bureaucratic in tone, listing kills like statistics. One report from Einsatzgruppe C states, Jews liquidated, 33,771. Another report lists over 90,000 Jews killed. The numbers are presented without emotion, as if they are describing agricultural production rather than mass murder. But behind every number was a person, a family, a community destroyed. At Babi Yar, the 33,771 included entire families, parents watching their children murdered, children watching their parents shot, elderly people and infants, skilled workers and intellectuals, entire communities, some that had existed for centuries, erased in 2 days. Some survivors of Babi Yar managed to escape before the massacre. They had fled Kiev when they heard rumors of the German order. They joined partisan groups or hid with sympathetic Ukrainians. These survivors would carry the memory of Babi Yar for the rest of their lives. Decades later, their testimony would become crucial to identifying and prosecuting those responsible for the massacre. But immediately after the killings, the Nazis attempted to cover up the evidence. They tried to destroy the mass graves. In late 1943, they ordered the exhumation and burning of bodies from multiple mass grave sites. Thousands of corpses were dug up and burned in large pyres. But the scale of the massacres was too large to completely erase. Bones remained. Survivors testified. The Soviet Union eventually recovered the sites and documented them. And the Nazis responsible, the officers and soldiers who had organized and carried out the killings, would eventually be identified and hunted. After the war, the Soviet Union recovered the sites of massacres and began documenting them. Soviet historians and investigators interviewed survivors and collected evidence. But in the immediate post-war years, the world was divided. The Soviet Union controlled the territories where most of the massacres had occurred. Western investigators had limited access. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the major Nazi leaders, but the trial was focused on those most responsible for overall policy. The commanders of the Einsatzgruppen were indicted, but some were not present in the dock. It wasn't until later trials, specifically the trials of Einsatzgruppen leaders held in Nuremberg between 1947 and 1952, that comprehensive prosecutions of the mobile killing units occurred. These trials were called the Einsatzgruppen Trial. 24 defendants were tried for crimes against humanity and murder. Among them were Otto Ohlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe. Ohlendorf admitted to the killings, but claimed he had been following orders. He testified that his unit had murdered over 90,000 Jews, many of them at Babi Yar and in other Ukrainian massacre sites. Also tried was Walther Bierkamp, commander of Einsatzgruppe D. Also tried was Arthur Nebe, commander of Einsatzgruppe B. The prosecution presented testimony from survivors of the massacres. These survivors described what they had witnessed. They described being present when the Nazis rounded up communities. They described seeing the trucks arrive. Some described hearing the gunfire from the ravines. One survivor, Dina Pronicheva, had been at Babi Yar when the massacre began. She had been stripped naked along with thousands of others, waiting to be shot. When the machine guns opened fire, she was struck by bullets, but remained alive under the bodies of those killed. She played dead throughout the massacre. When the Nazis left, she escaped. Decades later, Pronicheva testified about what she had witnessed at Babi Yar. Her testimony was detailed and precise. She described the organization of the massacre. She described the specific Nazi officers she had observed. She described the horror of lying under the bodies of the dead. Her testimony helped convict those responsible. Another survivor, a man named Leib Dawidowicz, had escaped Babi Yar before the massacre. He testified about what he knew about the Nazi plans. He testified about seeing the graves afterward. Survivors from other massacre sites also testified. From Ponary, survivors testified about the killings there. From Kamenets-Podolsk, survivors testified about that massacre. From other sites across Ukraine and Belarus, survivors provided testimony about the systematic nature of the killings. What the testimony established was that the killings were not spontaneous acts of violence by rogue soldiers. They were organized, systematic executions, ordered from the highest levels, and carried out by specific officers and soldiers under their command. The testimony also established the scale of the killings. The survivors' accounts, combined with Nazi documentation, made clear that over 1.4 million Jews had been murdered by the Einsatzgruppen across occupied Soviet territory. But the testimony also served another crucial purpose. It ensured that the names of those responsible would be remembered. The survivors identified specific Nazi officers. They described specific soldiers. They ensured that accountability would extend beyond the highest-ranking commanders to the mid-level officers and the soldiers who actually carried out the killings. One particularly important survivor was a man named Andras Weiss, who had survived multiple massacres and concentration camps. Weiss provided detailed testimony about the organizational structure of the killing units. He described how orders flowed from Berlin, through regional commands, to the soldiers in the field. He connected the killings to specific policies decided at the top of the Nazi government. His testimony helped establish the principle that individual soldiers could not claim they were just following orders, that accountability extended throughout the chain of command. The survivors testified not just to secure convictions, they testified to ensure that history would remember what happened. They testified so that the world would know the names and faces of those responsible. They testified so that the murdered would not be forgotten. The Einsatzgruppen Trial began in November 1947 in Nuremberg. 24 defendants sat in the dock. The trial would last over a year, concluding in August 1948. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Nazi documents showing the orders for massacres, reports detailing the numbers killed, testimony from survivors and from other Nazi personnel, physical evidence from the massacre sites. The defense arguments were predictable. Some claimed they had not participated in the killings. Others claimed they had opposed the killings but been forced to comply. Still others claimed they had tried to minimize casualties. Otto Ohlendorf took the stand in his own defense. He admitted to commanding Einsatzgruppe C. He admitted that his unit had murdered over 90,000 Jews. But he claimed that the murders were necessary, that he had tried to make them as humane as possible, and that he had opposed some of the excesses. His testimony was cold and bureaucratic. He described mass murder with the tone of someone discussing administrative procedures. The court was unimpressed. Walther Bierkamp, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, also testified. He provided similar justifications. He claimed to have opposed the killings but been forced to participate. He claimed to have tried to minimize casualties. The court did not believe him either. Arthur Nieb, commander of Einsatzgruppe B, faced slightly different circumstances. Nieb had actually been involved in the 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. After the war, he was captured by the Soviets and executed in 1945, before the Einsatzgruppen trial could proceed. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against the defendants was overwhelming. The Nazi documentation was irrefutable. The survivor testimony was consistent and credible. The defendants' defenses were implausible. On August 10, 1948, the verdicts were delivered. 14 of the 24 defendants were sentenced to death. These included Otto Ohlendorf, Walther Bierkamp, and other commanders and senior officers of the Einsatzgruppen. 7 were sentenced to life imprisonment, 2 were sentenced to 20 years, 1 was sentenced to 10 years. The remaining defendants were either acquitted or had charges dropped. The death sentences were carried out by hanging in Nuremberg on June 7, 1951. Otto Ohlendorf and the other condemned Einsatzgruppen commanders were hanged. Ohlendorf went to his death showing no remorse. According to witnesses, he remained calm and composed. He showed no apparent emotion as the noose was placed around his neck. The hangings marked an important milestone in post-war justice. The Einsatzgruppen commanders, men who had ordered and overseen the murder of over 1.4 million Jews, had been held accountable. But the Einsatzgruppen trial was not the only trial of those responsible for the massacres. Soviet authorities had their own trials. In the Soviet Union, several of those responsible for the killings were prosecuted and executed. But many of the details of Soviet trials were kept secret or were conducted as show trials with political purposes beyond justice. In other countries, trials continued. In the 1960s, German prosecutors began investigating those involved in the Einsatzgruppen, the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, established in West Germany in 1958, systematically pursued cases. One significant case involved Kurt Christmann, a member of Einsatzgruppe D. Christmann had survived the war and lived in Germany for decades. In 1960, he was identified and arrested. He was tried in Frankfurt and convicted of participation in mass murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1963. He died in prison in 1978. Another significant case involved Alfred Feldes, also a member of Einsatzgruppe D. Feldes had fled to South America after the war. He was eventually tracked down and extradited back to Germany. He was tried and convicted in the 1990s, decades after the war. He died in prison without ever being released. The cases continued into the 2000s and beyond. As long as those responsible for the Einsatzgruppen killings were alive, there was potential for prosecution. But the long delay between the crimes and the trials raised important questions. Could justice that came decades late be meaningful? Could it truly serve the victims and their families? After the Einsatzgruppen trial concluded in 1951, many believed that justice had been served. The major commanders had been executed. The trials had documented what happened. But it became clear that many perpetrators had escaped. Some had died in the chaos of the war's end. Others had disappeared. Still others had gone into hiding, changing their names and identities. For decades, Nazi hunters and survivor organizations tracked down those responsible. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, spent his life tracking Einsatzgruppen members and other Nazi war criminals. The search was often arduous. Records were incomplete. Witnesses had to be tracked down and interviewed. Some perpetrators had fled to South America or other remote locations. But the determination to find those responsible never entirely disappeared. In the 1960s, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials brought renewed focus to Nazi crimes. While primarily focused on Auschwitz personnel, the trials also investigated broader Nazi crimes. This revived interest in pursuing Einsatzgruppen members. In West Germany, the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes systematically reviewed cases. Investigators tracked down former Einsatzgruppen members living in Germany. Many were still alive decades after the war. One significant case involved Karl Schulz, who had been a junior officer in Einsatzgruppe C. Schulz had survived the war and lived in Bavaria. In 1960, he was identified. He was tried in Munich and convicted of participation in mass murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Another case involved Heinrich Lohse, a Nazi official who had overseen occupied territories in Ukraine. Lohse survived the war and was initially tried but acquitted in the 1950s. But in the 1960s, new investigations found additional evidence against him. He was retried and convicted. He died in prison in 1964. In the 1970s, the investigation efforts continued. Several Einsatzgruppen members were identified and brought to trial. One particularly significant case involved the investigation into Babi Yar specifically. Survivor testimony had identified specific Nazi officers responsible for the massacre. Investigators tracked down several of them. Wilhelm Rauke was a Nazi officer who had participated in selections of Jews for deportation and massacre. He had survived the war and fled to Canada, where he lived under an assumed name for decades. In 1981, he was identified. He was extradited to West Germany and tried. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1983. The case of Rauke demonstrated that even those who had successfully hidden for decades could be found. But it also showed that the passage of time made trials more difficult. Rauke was elderly by the time of his trial. Witnesses had died or aged. The events were distant memories. Yet the trials continued. Because the principle remained, those responsible for mass murder could not escape accountability simply by hiding long enough. In the 1980s and 1990s, the investigations expanded. German authorities pursued not just the senior officers, but also the rank-and-file soldiers who had carried out the killings. One case involved Helmut Rauke, a different person from Wilhelm Rauke. Helmut had been a member of Einsatzgruppe D. He survived the war and lived in Canada. He was identified, extradited, and tried in the 1980s. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Another case involved Ivan Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian collaborator. Demjanjuk had been identified as having participated in massacres. He was extradited and tried in Israel. His case became internationally famous, as his legal team argued he had been misidentified. But the court found him guilty and sentenced him to death. The execution was not carried out, as Demjanjuk appealed the conviction, and the case remained in legal limbo. The cases were not always successful. Some defendants were acquitted. Some fled before they could be arrested. Some died before trials could be completed. But the persistent effort to hold accountable those responsible for the massacres sent a clear message. Time does not erase criminal responsibility. The passage of decades does not provide immunity from justice. In the 2000s, German prosecutors continued to pursue elderly perpetrators. A 90-year-old former Gestapo officer was tried. An 85-year-old former concentration camp guard was convicted. The prosecutions continued even as those involved grew older. The principle established through the Einsatzgruppen Trial and the subsequent prosecutions became embedded in international law. Those responsible for crimes against humanity can be pursued and prosecuted regardless of how much time has passed. Babi Yar occupies a unique place in the memory of the Holocaust. More Jews were murdered there in 2 days than in any single massacre during the war. For decades after the war, Babi Yar remained unmarked. The Soviet Union wanted to commemorate the site, but the Soviet government was also reluctant to emphasize Jewish suffering separately from Soviet suffering. The official narrative was that Soviet citizens, without specific mention of Jews, had been murdered there. This began to change in the 1960s. In 1966, a memorial was erected at Babi Yar, but it did not specifically mention Jews. Soviet authorities resisted singling out Jewish victims as deserving special remembrance. This changed in 1991. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became independent. A Jewish memorial was erected specifically honoring the 33,771 Jews murdered at Babi Yar. But the memory of Babi Yar extends far beyond the memorial site. It has become a symbol of the Holocaust, a reminder of the scale of Nazi crimes. Dina Pronicheva, the survivor who testified about Babi Yar, spent her remaining years speaking about what had happened. Her testimony, preserved in video and text, continues to be used to educate people about the massacre. Today, Babi Yar is one of the most visited Holocaust memorial sites. Tens of thousands of people visit each year. School groups come to learn about the Holocaust. Survivors' descendants come to remember their families. Historians come to document the history. The memorial has been expanded and improved over the years. A museum documents the events. Plaques and inscriptions tell the story of those who were murdered. The site is maintained as a place of remembrance and education. But remembrance is not passive. It requires active effort to ensure that the memory is kept alive, that each new generation learns what happened, and that the responsibility to remember is passed forward. In recent decades, various organizations have worked to preserve the memory of Babi Yar and other massacres. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has extensive documentation. Yad Vashem in Israel maintains records of victims and perpetrators. The Shoah Foundation preserves video testimony from survivors. These efforts ensure that even as the last survivors die and the direct witnesses fade away, the memory is preserved. The names of those murdered are recorded. The names of those responsible are documented. This preservation of memory serves multiple purposes. It honors the victims by ensuring they are not forgotten. It documents the crimes so that historians can study them. And it ensures that the responsibility to remember is passed to future generations. One particularly important project is the Names of Victims initiative. Organizations are working to record the names of every person murdered in the Holocaust. For many victims, only numbers survive. But survivors and their descendants are working to recover names, to restore individuality to those who were reduced to statistics. At Babi Yar, this project continues. Names are being recorded. Families are being documented. The 33,771 victims are being transformed from a number into individuals. This work is crucial, because while justice through prosecution is important, justice through remembrance is equally vital. The victims deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as people. The murderers at Babi Yar, the Nazi officers and soldiers who ordered and carried out the massacre, are also being remembered. But they are remembered as criminals, as perpetrators, as men who committed one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Some of them were executed, some were imprisoned. Many escaped justice in the legal sense, but not in the sense of history. Their names are recorded in association with mass murder. Their actions are documented. Their legacy is one of infamy. The trials that convicted them ensured that this record would be official, that it would be preserved in legal documents and courtroom transcripts. But even those who escaped legal prosecution are now being pursued through memory. As new documents are discovered, as technology allows for better investigation, the names of additional perpetrators are being revealed. In 2016, Ukraine opened the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, specifically dedicated to preserving the memory of the massacre. The center has become a major educational resource, ensuring that new generations understand what happened. In 2021, on the 80th anniversary of the massacre, the memorial was significantly expanded. New exhibits were added. Educational programs were increased. The commitment to remembrance was reaffirmed. This ongoing work is what gives meaning to the phrase, "The memory lives on." It is not passive remembrance, but active commitment to ensuring that the crimes are remembered, that the victims are honored, and that the perpetrators are held accountable through the court of history, even when legal prosecutions are no longer possible. More than 80 years have passed since Babi Yar. Most of those directly involved in the massacre, perpetrators, survivors, and witnesses, are now gone. The last of the major Einsatzgruppen commanders were executed or died in prison decades ago. Yet the work of accountability continues. In the 2020s, German prosecutors continue to pursue cases against elderly perpetrators of Nazi crimes. The principle established at Nuremberg and refined through subsequent trials remains in force. There is no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity. In 2021, German prosecutors charged a 96-year-old former SS member with being an accessory to murder at Stutthof concentration camp. The man was too infirm to stand trial, but the case represented the ongoing commitment to pursue accountability. In 2022, a 101-year-old man was convicted of being an accessory to murder at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. While the conviction is largely symbolic, a man of that age is unlikely to serve any prison sentence. It represents an important principle, that no one who participated in Nazi crimes should die with the official legal status of innocence. This principle applies to those responsible for the Einsatzgruppen massacres as well. If any perpetrators remain alive and have not been prosecuted, they could potentially still be tried. The investigations by Nazi hunters continue. Simon Wiesenthal's organization still operates. Survivor organizations continue to track down perpetrators. Historians continue to discover new documents that might identify additional perpetrators. But beyond legal prosecution, the memory work continues. The memorials at Babi Yar and other massacre sites serve as testaments to what happened. Educational programs ensure that new generations understand the scale and nature of the crimes. The testimony of survivors, preserved in video and recorded format, ensures that the voices of those who experienced the massacres directly will continue to be heard even after all survivors are gone. This is crucial, because survivor testimony carries a moral weight that no historical document can match. When someone describes lying under the bodies of murdered family members, as Dina Pronicheva did, it creates an emotional understanding of what happened that statistics and documents cannot. The prosecutions of perpetrators also serve an important purpose beyond legal punishment. They establish an official record. They force the perpetrators to face their crimes. They provide a platform for victims' voices. The trials also serve an educational function. Each trial brings renewed attention to Nazi crimes. Each verdict reaffirms the principle that accountability is possible, even decades later. But there is also a troubling reality. Many perpetrators escaped justice entirely. Some were never identified. Some fled to countries that would not extradite them. Some died before they could be brought to trial. Historians estimate that only a small fraction of those who participated in Einsatzgruppen killings were ever prosecuted. Most escaped. Many lived comfortable lives after the war, building families and careers. This is a painful truth. Justice for the 1.4 million Jews murdered by the Einsatzgruppen was incomplete. Many victims' families saw no prosecution of those responsible. But the trials that did occur, and the memory work that continues, serve important purposes. They establish that accountability is possible. They honor the victims by ensuring they are remembered. They educate future generations about what can happen when societies embrace racism and genocide. The testimony of survivors about Babi Yar and other massacres has become a crucial part of Holocaust education. When people learn that 33,771 people were murdered in 2 days, when they hear survivor accounts of the horror, when they see the memorials, it creates an understanding that the Holocaust was not an abstract historical event, but a human reality of unimaginable suffering. This understanding is crucial for preventing future atrocities. As Holocaust survivor and educator Elie Wiesel said, "To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." The continuing work of remembrance at Babi Yar and other massacre sites ensures that the dead are not forgotten. The investigations into perpetrators, even those that occurred decades after the crimes, ensure that accountability remains a possibility. The principle established through the Einsatzgruppen Trial and subsequent prosecutions, that crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations, has become embedded in international law. It has shaped the prosecution of war criminals in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and other places. It has ensured that those who commit genocide know that they may someday be held accountable, regardless of how much time passes or how well they hide. But accountability through law is only part of the story. Equally important is accountability through memory. The victims of Babi Yar and the other Einsatzgruppen massacres are remembered. Their names are being recovered. Their stories are being documented. Their experiences are being preserved for future generations. The perpetrators are also remembered, but their memory is marked by infamy. Their actions are recorded as crimes. Their legacies are associated with mass murder. This is a form of accountability that no trial can provide. It is the judgment of history. As we move further into the 21st century, and as the last survivors of the Holocaust pass away, this historical judgment becomes increasingly important. The trials will eventually end. The perpetrators will all be gone. But the memory will continue. Memorials will stand. Educational programs will persist. Video testimony will be preserved. The names of victims will be recorded. And through this memory, the victims will continue to bear witness to what happened. Their voices, their stories, their suffering will continue to demand that the world remember, that the world understand, that the world commit to ensuring that such atrocities never happen again. This is the legacy of Babi Yar and the Einsatzgruppen trials. Not just the verdicts and executions, though those matter, but the ongoing commitment to remembrance, education, and accountability that stretches across decades and will continue for centuries to come. The memory lives on, and in that memory, justice lives on as well.